Welcome back to Mayo Clinic Radio. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cozine.
And I'm Tracy McCrae.
According to Dr. Google, the most searched question of 2018 was, what is the keto diet? Keto, short for ketogenic, is a high-fat, very low-carbohydrate diet. The idea is that getting most of your calories from fat forces your body to use different energy pathways. Instead of carbs for energy, the body burns fat, entering a state called ketosis.
Ketosis, what could go wrong? Sounds like a great plan. Sounds a little dangerous to me. That's why I've not tried it. Well, here to discuss the benefits and the drawbacks of the keto diet is Mayo Clinic dietitian Kate Zaradsky. Welcome back to the program, Kate. It's nice to see you again.
Good to be here. Thank you.
What is this thing?
Yeah, what is it? It's the most Googled question, so it must be something.
Right, and I'll have to say from my background, and I've worked with Mayo Clinic for 19 years, and when I started and was working more so in pediatrics, this was a diet that we used in the hospital, and then sent children home on this diet so it would help control their seizures. And that's really how I was introduced to and knew of the ketogenic diet. And
Me too. Yeah.
So when people started talking about, oh, I'm on the keto diet and I'm doing the keto diet, I was like, really?
I asked several people if they had seizure disorder history. I said no.
Right. And I thought, in my experience, I would spend an entire day doing calculations of how much fat, how much carbohydrate, even how much protein. And the ketogenic diet, as it's used to control seizures, is really done in very strict ratios. And you're very cautious about weighing and measuring and being very precise with the amount and the types of foods to make sure that you have the response you want to help that child.
Oh, so a ketogenic diet, you're saying, is maybe different than what people consider a keto diet.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think what we're seeing today, where when people are describing to me, well, I'm doing the keto diet, I'll often ask, like, well, how are you doing it?
Yeah.
And oftentimes in their description, they're eating fat and protein in large quantities and eating very few carbohydrate-rich foods. And so in my opinion, that sounds more like a modified Atkins type diet where you're allowing yourself ample quantities of both protein and fat and just limiting the carbohydrates. And I know there are people who are now, talking to more people and reading more about it, there are people who are looking at this in true carbohydrate restriction, but also maybe some protein restriction. But I think that's maybe a difference that we're maybe seeing across the board that I'm not sure people fully understand what that means.
People are using this for weight loss, right?
Right. And I think, so really to have, and I think one thing to understand is there's differing degrees of ketogenesis, being in ketosis. And so oftentimes that's measured by people measuring their urine ketones. And so people will get, test strips and test their ketones. And it may say that they're in ketosis, but probably the degree of ketosis is probably a variable to be taken into account there. And I think maybe that's, the difference we see between something that's clinical and not.
When I think about ketosis, sometimes I get a little nervous. I think, well, gosh, we don't really actually want you in ketosis. But can you tell us about that?
Right. And I think this is something that is the unknown with when people are saying, well, I'm going to put myself on a ketogenic diet and be in ketosis, because really when you think about what ketosis is, it's a alternative pathway that our body has to use in times of emergency and times when your brain in particular when your brain needs energy and for some reason there's not food, particularly carbohydrate, because that's the fuel your brain prefers, when that's not around. And so your body has this kind of a backup system to make sure you survive. And so it's able to produce these ketone bodies to keep you functioning. And so you're right. It's something that historically has alarmed us in terms of we don't necessarily want people to be in ketosis. It can be very dangerous. Ketone bodies are considered toxic. Your body has two ways of getting rid of them. You either exhale them through your breath or you urinate them out. And so it is a stressful kind of process on your body too, because your body is trying to rid itself of these ketone bodies.
Well, when we were getting started, Dr. Kozing, you and I both said we know people who
I know
have
several
lost,
people.
lost hundreds of
I think
pounds.
people I know socially or people that patients of mine, and big weight loss, and they feel great.
Well, and so for them, they consider that to be, finger quotes, successful.
Yeah.
But possibly, we're talking two different languages here.
So,
the ketosis and those ketones and things, that is not someplace that you want to be health-wise. There's got to be a middle ground here.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where there's probably where we have a gap in our research and our scientific understanding of really what does this mean for somebody long term. And I think there's some emerging data, but it's fairly short-term data that people can lose weight on a ketogenic or a very low carbohydrate diet over the course of a few weeks into months. However, like most restrictive diets, what the literature is saying is that after 6 months, after a year, these diets are very difficult to sustain because people miss eating fruits and vegetables and pastas and breads and other foods that have carbohydrate, because most food does. And so it's a very restrictive diet. So it is difficult to sustain for any long period of time.
Let's have the conversation then about healthy carbs, because that's kind of where some of the confusion comes from. I'm cutting out carbs can mean, well, for me, that means pasta and bread. But it also can mean fruits and vegetables.
Right. And I think if you really start looking at what foods have carbohydrates, most do. I think even, there's the obvious, there's the breads and the pastas. And I think now most people recognize fruits and vegetables. But even our dairy products have carbohydrate, and are even things like almonds, have some carbohydrates. So I think people saying, well, I'm going to eat almonds on my ketogenic diet or my low-carb diet, but depending on the quantity that you eat, truly that's going to impact the degree of ketosis that you're in. And then I think another piece of this, too, is that the idea that, again, from a survival standpoint, our body's able to convert protein into carbohydrate, because that's what our body wants to run off of. And so I think looking at, again, going back to your question of carbohydrates, healthy carbohydrates, when we think about the majority of the foods that Mother Nature has provided for us, probably about 85% of them really do have carbon.
So is the answer just to reduce carbohydrate rather than eliminate? Or do we...
Right, and I don't even know that we have to say, it might be, look at the quality of your carbohydrate.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think the more wholesome that carbohydrate is.
So maybe a whole grain instead of a bag of Doritos.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
There's probably, and portion's always going to matter.
Yeah.
So kind of it's the quality and the quantity of the type of carbohydrate that
We
you
can
choose.
share a bag of Doritos.
I would love to share a bag of Doritos with you.
Is there any long-term data on the keto diet?
I have not seen real long-term data. I don't know that there's much data beyond the year mark. And the data that I've seen in regards to weight loss in that regard is that people might lose weight that initial 6 months, but by the year mark, there really isn't a statistical difference in the amount of weight loss compared to maybe other diets.
We've been talking about the keto diet with Mayo Clinic dietitian Kate Zaratsky. We're going to take a short break.
When we come back, we'll compare the keto diet with other popular diet plans, the Mediterranean, DASH, and Mayo Clinic diets. Welcome back to Mayo Clinic Radio. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Kozine.
And I'm Tracy McCrae. We've been talking about diets with Mayo Clinic dietitian Kate Zaratsky. And if people are interested in improving what they eat, and you always have to be in favor of that at the beginning of the year, trying to turn over a new leaf. Every Monday is a chance to turn over a new leaf, or every day is a chance to turn over a new leaf. Let's talk about some other diets that possibly would be a little bit better to choose instead of keto. And maybe we don't even call them diets.
I think that's a great suggestion, and I think we've even seen that with our dietary guidelines for Americans that comes from the USDA. The last iteration that was released, they started looking at diet patterns, or looking at the patterns, or rather than looking at the way people eat, rather than trying to call it a diet. And I think that's just it. I think because we don't know what the perfect diet is, and if one even exists, but we do have some evidence that says that there's maybe ways or styles of eating, that there's certain foods that within these patterns that may be beneficial to long-term health, and I think that's the important part of.
Do you have a favorite pattern to recommend?
Not necessarily, and
Okay.
actually, when I meet with people, I like to say, like, tell me about what you're currently eating, because as you were saying, I think every day is kind of an opportunity to say, how am I going to do it today? And if we have if someone eats a certain way, it's part of their habit, it's part of their lifestyle. And if they're looking to improve that, which I think we all could kind of, hop on that spectrum somewhere, that we could say, if it's, I want to eat more fruits and vegetables, or if it's more whole grains, or maybe I'd like to, meet the recommendation of having fish twice a week, whatever it might be, I think we can all say there's probably a little wiggle room to improve our diet, or look at eating better.
Are the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet the same?
They're not the same, but they're similar. And I
Okay.
think when you start getting into, say, the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, and even the Mayo Clinic diet, and other diets that have kind of been recognized in terms of their long-term health benefits, you'll start seeing that there are similarities. And I think that just strengthens kind of the cause and the message that these types of foods, the types of foods that you're seeing within this style of eating, that there's probably a good reason to eat this way.
So what are some of the types of foods in the Mediterranean diet?
And so when I think of the Mediterranean,
Fish.
yes,
I wish I was on the Mediterranean
Yes.
right now. That sounds great.
right. And I think a lot of people may think of fish and olive oil. I think those are two that come to mind right away. So really, if we kind of step back from that, it's, yes, fish in terms of healthy fats, olive oil in terms of healthy fats, but also, when you look at the Mediterranean diet and even the Mediterranean lifestyle, that there is many fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, beans, legumes, those types of foods. It's
Whole foods?
more whole foods, more plant-based foods.
Yeah.
I don't hear Doritos.
Shoot.
And that's not the D. That's not Doritos and
Yeah.
the D in the DASH
That's
diet,
right,
are they?
right.
What's the DASH diet?
And I would say, on the DASH diet, similarly, has similar.
Can you remind us what DASH stands for?
Yes,
It's not Doritos are sure
Super
happy. Yeah.
surely make you happy.
Yeah.
The DASH diet stands for the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And so similarly, and maybe a bit of history. So the Mediterranean diet coming out of the Mediterranean region, and it was really kind of a look at why are people who live in that region not dying of heart disease and kind of living long, full lives, comparatively to, say, their Western neighbors or their Northern neighbors. And so I would say kind of on the U.S. side, this is almost like our kind of reflection or our answer to a Mediterranean type of diet, looking at the types of foods you eat, but we took the approach of looking at nutrients. And so what nutrients are we getting from certain food groups that may be beneficial in terms of lowering your blood pressure? And those nutrients that they specifically looked at were eating less salt, but also in combination with having more calcium, more magnesium, and more potassium. Reflective, the foods that give you those nutrients, calcium coming from dairy foods being most obvious, but calcium can come from other plant foods like leafy greens or broccoli or even almonds, and potassium primarily coming from fruits and vegetables, but coming from other foods as well, and magnesium, nut seeds and cocoa, good sources of those.
Great.
One of the things that you get to do when you when you fill in for Dr. Shives is you get to ask questions about anything you're interested
well,
in.
I had mine on the tip of my tongue.
Go right
so
ahead.
I'm really interested in veganism, and I've been reading a lot about the blue zones, and so those are the areas of the world where people live again long, full lives beyond just the Mediterranean. So, for example, there are parts of Japan where the life expectancy, I think, is into the late 80s or early 90s, and they found that these people have relatively low stress and tend to eat more of a whole food plant-based diet. So very few animal products on any sort of regular basis. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Right. And I think that is a really interesting kind of way to look at, say, nutritional research even, because I think it's a difficult thing to do. It's difficult to get really good long-term data in nutrition. And I think so when we start looking at patterns of ways people eat and then looking at that in combination with their lifestyle and what are their outcomes, looking at areas like blue zones, give us some insight into that. And so I think when you, again, look at the idea that people in these blue zones are maybe eating more plant-based diets or incorporating more whole foods, it's kind of real whole foods, even if if we go to maybe northern regions of the world where they're eating just more fish as a kind of a part of their diet, but maybe not as many plants. We see those types of things. So I think in terms of vegetarianism or veganism, the idea that you can eat a very nutritious, well-balanced diet, you can meet all your nutrient needs with plants for the most part.
Except B12.
And I say there's those couple nutrients that we'll pay a little closer attention to, one being B12, the other being iron, just because it's a little more difficult to absorb and from plant sources. And also we'll want to make sure you're getting enough vitamin D too. Yeah.
How has it been at your house?
Well, I was telling Tracy that we did a little vegan experiment at my house, and it was quite gassy. But it was, we
But
felt
you eat
good.
a lot of vegetables
we
already.
were big veggie eaters before, so it wasn't a huge lifestyle shift. But what I did it for a couple of reasons. Now, I'm not trying to lose weight, but it was to kind of see what it was like because, I recommend these patterns of eating to people, and I wanted to see, is this a change that I could potentially make, in Minnesota in the middle of winter? And it was fun. It was actually really kind of stimulating to try some new diets, and the gas got better. And we've kind of settled on a low animal product lifestyle.
Occasional.
It's sustainable. Yeah. I think fewer than we were, less, certainly very infrequent red meat and less chicken and fish than we were eating before.
Well, you can change your taste buds. I know that's what people think. There's no way I could ever give up steak, or there's no way I could ever. But you can start to change your taste buds and kind of modify that. That is a fact, isn't it?
Right. And
I'm not imagining that.
You're not. I think we all have preferences. We do, and that's okay. That's what makes us kind of unique individuals and humans. But the what you're describing is the idea that there's a name for that because there's a name for everything. It's flexitarian diets. And so the idea that if you still wanted to have a steak or fish or whatever it might be, you could still do that. But the idea that the base of your diet, the kind of the majority of your diet is plants.
Sort of the intentional base of what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. There's eating more plants, I think, sets you up for kind of the baseline of kind of what your health picture is going to look like.
And just because I have to ask, because I'm actually getting my kids to look at the labels. It's taken a long time. They're teens now, but they will actually turn around and look at the label. The less ingredients on a label, the kids are starting to notice that makes a difference. And it's funny because they'll be comparing two yogurts or something like that and one of them will just have like 3 ingredients and the other one has got a whole page of ingredients that just fails down. What difference does that make for someone when you're choosing products? If you're choosing a Greek yogurt, what difference does it make if there's a lot of ingredients or only a few?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's I think we want to say absolutely that the one with fewer understandable words is the one to choose. And I'd say as a general rule, I think that's an that's okay. But I think we also have to remember kind of on the flip side that we have the privilege of living in a society where we have safe food.
Yep.
And so the idea that there are some preservatives put in the food to maintain its safety, I think there's also something to be said for that. So sometimes when we see big words that we don't necessarily know how to pronounce, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but if it makes you take a pause and think twice about what you're eating, I think that's a good thing. Because the more we can eat food that looks like its whole, real, as Mother Nature intended self, then that's really what we're going after. If it needs to have a few preservatives in it to keep it safe, that's okay too.
I have no doubt we could keep talking diet questions, but we have to be done.
We do.
We've been talking about diets and healthy lifestyle choices with Mayo Clinic dietitian Kate Zaretsky. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.